Even as a non-American, the close-up shot of the massive USA on the side of the Saturn as it slowly lifted from the pad is to me still one of the most impressive and iconic pieces of space-related footage ever shot, and even now it still fills me with emotion. This and many, many other launch shots of the Apollo and later Space Shuttle missions are still so good, not only because they're amazing eye candy, but because they showed the launches in ways that we just don't seem to see these days. Many of these were originally intended as engineering footage and only meant to be seen by a few to verify everything was going according to plan or record it when it didn't. These close-up shots of things like the engines starting up and going full throttle from just a few meters away, all the way to the stage separation some 30-odd miles high, were caught in amazing detail on what many would regard as old and antiquated film cameras. Yet, with all the advances in camera technology we have made over the last 60 years, we still seem to struggle to create shots of the modern day equivalents, namely Artemis and the Starship launches, that match the Saturn and Shuttle. So in this video, we can enjoy some of those iconic pieces of footage again and look at maybe why we aren't seeing the same for the latest generation of space hardware, but also the opportunities new cameras bring. Back in the days of the space race, the US government, mostly through NASA, made public information films that would show the progress of the Mercury, Gemini and Apollo missions, often going into great detail about how they were going to try to achieve a particular outcome on almost every subject, from how the engines were being tested to what the astronauts would be doing in space. Thousands of these films were made and helped keep the public interest in space going in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Now with the internet, they have found a whole new audience. These films are now an invaluable source of information if you want to find out more about our struggle of how we got to where we are today and how the race for space was seen at a time in a world when it was very different to what we live in today. Launches, both test and real, were filmed and showed the successes and failures in glorious colour, but these films were not just to show the public where their hard-earned tax dollars were going. Their primary purpose was to record where things went right and wrong. This wasn't a new idea. In World War II, the German engineers recorded the test flights of the very first ballistic rocket system, the V2. After the war, these ideas came with them to the US as they started work on creating the successors to the V2, which would eventually become the Saturn rockets of the Apollo program. From 1950 to 1998, there were over 3,400 launches from what is now known as the Kennedy Space Center, and out of those, 450 failures occurred. Documenting the tests on film became more sophisticated as the rockets became larger, and the placement of cameras into areas that would have been impossible with human camera operators like in the early days of the German V2. Some of the most amazing shots were from the mobile launcher platform of the MLP, which held the Apollo Saturn V and later Space Shuttle. In the time of the Saturn rockets, the MLP also held the launch umbilical tower as well as the Saturn V. When the shuttle came along, the tower was removed and a fixed service structure at the launch pad was used instead, leaving just the shuttle to be carried on the MLP. Up to 120 cameras were used to capture the footage, not only from right next to the rockets, but also from camera platforms around the entire launch site and up and down the coast to track the craft until they were at the edge of space. Starting with Apollo, cameras were placed in locations that seemed almost impossible and allowed them to capture never-seen-before images like this, footage of the Saturn V on the Apollo 11 mission to the Moon. The camera was a photosonic 16mm camera running at 500 frames per second, and probably using a 10mm lens, which was common at these distances. These were used around the MLP to record high-speed footage for engineering purposes. This one, known as E8 or Echo 8, looked at the F1 engines and the hold-down arms for 5 seconds before the launch till 15 seconds after the launch. This footage would also show that one of the covers for the hold-down arms failed to retract and cover the arm completely. It also showed the effectiveness of the water deluge system and the ablative paint on the hold-down arm covers. This and other cameras were mounted within about 5 meters of the rocket to look at various aspects of the launch. Cameras were also mounted on the launch umbilical tower to monitor the swing arms retracting, supply lines disconnecting, and to check the exterior of the rocket as it left the pad. And this is where we get to see the massive USA lettering passing the camera. When the shuttle was in service, cameras were mounted on the fixed service structure to record the same as the shuttle left the pad and look for damaged heat tiles, SRBs, and covering foam from the fuel tank. Back on the MLP, to survive the incredible heat and blast on the F1s, they were housed in steel enclosures made from 1/2 inch thick or 12.5mm steel plate. Inside that was another enclosure made from 1/2 inch thick or 12.5mm aluminium plate. So as not to pose an explosion risk because of the vented hydrogen from the tanks and the rocket engines that could possibly get into the enclosures before the engines ignited, these enclosures were pressurized with 7 psi of nitrogen throughout the launch. The cameras then looked through special quartz windows to withstand the heat and blast of the rocket exhaust. Although this is shot on 16mm film, the quality of the film is still fairly high even by today's standards. 16mm film has an equivalent digital resolution of around about 2300 by 1700 pixels, depending upon the grain size of the film and how it was scanned. But it's the way it reacts when it is overexposed which really marks it out compared to HD digital cameras. Whilst the exhaust from the F1 engine is very bright, as in this Apollo footage, you can still see the blue sky in the background and the dark areas on the MLP. It's only when the rocket has lifted up enough to allow the water from the deluge system to be blown around instead of flashing to steam that the image whites out for a moment before coming back again. We can see this better in the footage from the shuttle launch with the solid rocket boosters or SRBs and the RS-25 main engines. The SRBs in reality are much, much brighter than the RS-25s, which just burn hydrogen and oxygen, producing hot water vapour or gas, which doesn't produce much light in the process. The SRBs use a solid propellant that contains ammonium perchlorate as an oxidizer, 69.6% by weight, atomised aluminium powder as the fuel, 16%, iron oxide as a catalyst, 0.4%, and a binder which also acts as a fuel at 12.04%. These materials burn much brighter by as much as 1,000 times more than the RS-25s. Looking at a normal shuttle launch from a distance, the SRBs are as bright as the sun, and to the naked eye you can't really see anything around the engines. But looking at this footage taken from the 16mm camera on the MLP, you can see not only the RS-25 exhaust plumes, but also the SRB exhaust and the blue sky behind, really showing the very wide dynamic range of a film and its ability to capture both dark and very bright images at the same time. The 16mm cameras used an automatic exposure system which can be seen operating as the sky turns a deeper shade of blue as the very bright exhausts of the SRB come into the shot, but it doesn't wash out the entire image. We can compare this to a shot of the SLS rocket on the Artemis 1 mission back in November 2022 using modern digital cameras. Because this was a night launch, there's much less overall light in the shot, but you will see that the SRBs overexpose the image, so much so that you can't see anything once they light up and come into the shot. Seen from another camera that had a lower exposure setting, the image is now very dark until the SRBs light up the scene. And even then, you can only see the exhaust plumes and not much else of the rocket or the surrounding areas, considering just how bright these SRBs are. This highlights the biggest difference between film and digital cameras, and that's its ability of film to handle overexposed situations. I came across a great example by Bill Lawson on his YouTube channel comparing the dynamic range of film versus digital over a 21 stop range of underexposure to overexposure. For what I'm about to show, I will use only the overexposure test. You can see the full test in the link in the description. This is using film and digital still cameras, but the same principle would apply to moving images. As the exposure goes up one stop at a time, the film image gradually loses detail and becomes progressively more grainy the higher the exposure. However, the digital image quickly starts to break down after +6 stops, and by +10 stops it's completely washed out. The very latest top-end digital cameras like the Red V Raptor has 17 stops of dynamic range, which can match that of film, but I don't know if they can handle the very overexposed images in the same way that film can. Maybe any Red users out there can let me know in the comments. Another issue is that most modern CMOS sensor cameras have an issue called a rolling shutter effect. This is caused because the image of each frame is built up by scanning the image line by line from the top to the bottom of the frame. This takes a certain amount of time, so with a fast-moving image, or if the camera is subject to vibration like that from a launch of a very powerful rocket nearby, the image can move before the scan completes the frame, making the subject look like it's bending or jelly-like, which can be seen in this shot of the SpaceX Starship launch. Film cameras or digital cameras which have a global shutter expose the whole frame in one go, so rolling shutter is not an issue, as you can see in virtually every shot of the Apollo program in the 60s and 70s. On the issues of stability, the NASA long-range shots were taken with mobile camera mounts, which were developed from World War II anti-aircraft gun carriers. Even the modern Kino tracking mounts were very large and extremely sturdy, and had to be to hold multiple 3,800 to 5,000 mm lenses weighing over 100 kilograms each. Any slight shake induced by the vibration from a rocket or wind would make a shot focused on the high-speed moving rocket almost unusable. The use of lighter cameras and mounts today also contributes to the rather shaky takeoff videos we see. So whilst the change in camera technology may mean that we don't see the close-up engine shots like we did with the Apollo and Shuttle using film cameras, the miniaturization of today's cameras opens up new visual opportunities, such as in the staging section of the SpaceX Starship and the external views from the rockets during takeoff and in the reusable booster landings. Maybe one day we will get digital camera technology that will allow us to see close-ups of the engines at takeoff like we did with the Apollo and Shuttle days. But for these special images, we could just take a leaf out of the old book and just use film cameras again.